Fergus spent the biggest week of our year telling everyone he was on the floor of his downstairs toilet with something he'd eaten. He was, in fact, sitting at his desk at 12 minutes past 7 that Tuesday morning, putting a change live that I had asked him twice to leave alone. I found out about the vomiting straight away because he phoned me personally to describe it. I found out about the 12 minutes past 7 3 days later, in a room with 9 people in it and a printout on the table, and I'll be honest with you, it was worth the wait. There are 2 of us who own the filing product. Waste companies use it to tell the regulator what they moved, where it went, and what was in it. Every skip of contaminated soil, every drum of solvent, every load out of a hospital basement. It sounds dull, and it is dull right up until the quarter ends, and then it stops being dull, because if a firm misses the filing deadline, the fines are per return, and they are not small, and the compliance manager who missed it is the one who gets hauled in front of a director to explain. So 4 times a year we have 2 nights where a few hundred companies all try to file at once, and both of those nights I sleep with my phone face up on the bedside table. My name is Alistair, and I had a very specific reason to care about the senior developer role that Rosalind had dangled in front of both of us in April. Our daughter Elin is 6. She has a speech and language therapy block starting in September, 3 sessions a week, in a place at a small school 40 minutes down the A38 that specializes in exactly the way her brain works. Between the fees and the therapy and the fuel, it comes to £1,190 a month. Sian works 3 days at a dental practice and I do this, and the 2 of us had sat at the kitchen table in March with a notebook and worked out that we could do it if one of us earned about £11,000 a year more than we currently did. The senior role paid 11.5. That is not a metaphor for anything. That was the actual sum, written in biro, next to a doodle of a shark that Elin had added. What wakes me up at night is one machine. There is a single machine in our setup that talks to the regulator's system and comes back with a receipt number, and a return is not filed until it has that number. Everything goes through it. Everything. Hamish built it about 9 years ago against an interface older than my entire career, held together with things he understood and nobody else did. And the honest truth is that most of what it does exists in Hamish's head and nowhere else. He is a quiet Scot in his 50s who eats the same lunch every day and once told me, cheerfully, that if he got hit by a bus, we should probably just phone the regulator and ask if we could send things in on paper. Fergus, in my head only, was the weather vane. In any meeting, he pointed whichever way the room was blowing, and he could turn a full half circle in one sentence. He had this habit with bottles. He'd peel the label off in a single unbroken strip, roll it into a hard little pellet between his fingers, and line the pellets up along the edge of his desk like ammunition. By Friday, there'd be 11 of them. And I want to say the true thing before I say the rest of it, because it matters. In February, when Elin had her assessments, Fergus took over my on-call for 9 days without being asked and never once mentioned it. Not then and not after. He just did it. I found out from the rota. The launch was the regulator's fault, really. They changed the shape of the quarterly return, added 2 fields about the destination site, and gave everyone a hard date. That date landed in the same week as the filing deadline, which is like being told to rebuild the kitchen on Christmas Eve. So we had launch week, and launch week was also deadline week, and the office had that particular smell it gets when nobody is going home on time. The fight started 3 weeks out, in the room with the broken blind. Fergus wanted his one-click bulk filing feature in the launch. It let a customer with 200 sites file everything in one go instead of one at a time, and it was genuinely a good idea, and it was going to look extremely good next to somebody's name in a promotion conversation. I said no, and I said why, and I said it in words a person could follow. There is one machine that stamps the returns. If a customer clicks that button, 400 returns hit that machine in the same second. And there used to be a limit on how many could be in flight at once, a cap, and that cap got switched off in March so a demo would look faster. Trevor, who runs product and who I like more than this story makes it sound, frowned at me and said, "So it's a speed thing." "It is not a speed thing," I said. "It's what happens when it slows down. Nothing in our setup knows how to wait politely. If the stamping machine takes 30 seconds instead of 2, every other machine waiting on it gives up and asks again. And the asking again doesn't replace the first ask, it stacks on top of it. So the slower that one machine gets, the more work everybody throws at it, and it goes round and round until there's nothing left of it. I want 2 things. Put the cap back on, and teach the others to wait longer each time instead of shouting. Trevor wrote something down and said we'd look at it next quarter, which is the noise that place makes instead of no. Fergus peeled the label off a bottle of sparkling water while I was talking, rolled it, set it down. Then he said, and I remember the exact tone, that he thought I was being careful, and that careful was good, and that he'd hold bulk filing back. Meredith, who tests everything we build, and who has the most expressive eyebrows in the west of England, looked at me across the table with her face absolutely still, which for Meredith is a whole paragraph. She messaged me 8 minutes after we came out. Her message said, he agreed too fast. I typed 3 different replies and sent none of them, because I'd had the same thought, and I didn't want to be the person who says that out loud about a colleague who covered his on-call for 9 days. The Monday of launch week went the way those days go. The new return form went live at 6:30 in the morning, which meant I was at the kitchen table at 5:10 with a bowl of cereal and my laptop propped on a stack of Elin's library books, watching the first filings come through and reading the numbers off a screen to Yvonne in support, who was on the other end of the phone with her coat still on. 211 filings before 9. No errors that mattered. Jonah, 3 weeks into his first developer job, kept coming over to look at my screen like it was a fish tank, and at one point asked me if this was a big day, and Meredith said, from behind her monitor, without looking up, that he should ask again on Friday. At the standing meeting, Fergus said bulk filing was parked, and everyone nodded, and Trevor said good, and we talked about the support rota. Fergus ate a sausage roll at his desk at 4:30 in the afternoon and complained about the traffic on the portway and went home at 5:20. I want that on the record. Sausage roll, traffic, 5:20, absolutely fine. He rang me at 8:50 the next morning. I had Elin on my hip and I was doing toast one-handed, and I put him on speaker and set the phone on the windowsill. Mate, he said, I'm in bits. Something I ate. I've been up and down all night. I can't look at a screen without the room going sideways. Sian, behind me, mouthed who? And I mouthed back Fergus, and she made a face. I said, God, mate, that's rotten timing. I know, he said. I know. Don't tell Trevor I said this, but I'd rather be there. I feel like I'm bailing on you. And here's the thing. I believed him. I stood in my own kitchen with butter on my thumb and felt sorry for him, and told him to drink something with salt in it, and said we'd cope, and asked if he wanted me to pick anything up. He said no. He said he was going back to bed. Then he said, right, I'd better go, and there was a pause, and in that pause I heard the specific mechanical clatter of a keyboard being typed on, 3 or 4 words worth, and then it stopped. I noticed it, and I didn't do anything with it. That's the part I've thought about most. I put the phone down and got Elin's shoes on and drove to the office and told everyone Fergus had a bug, and Yvonne said her sister's whole house had it, and that was that. Meredith caught me by the kettle at about 11. She said, did he tell you he's ill? I said yes. She said, his name went green in the chat at 7:12 this morning. For minutes, then off again. Then she poured her tea and added, in exactly the same voice, that she wasn't accusing anyone of anything. She just notices things, it's literally her job. I said maybe he was checking messages from bed. She said maybe. And then Jonah came over to ask me about a customer who couldn't find the new destination field, and the day ate the rest of it. Tuesday held. Wednesday held beautifully. 440 filings on Wednesday, which was a record for a Wednesday. And Trevor stood up at the standing meeting and did a little speech about the team and used the word seamless twice. Fergus came in on Wednesday afternoon looking gray and brave, with a bottle of flat lemonade, and got a small round of applause from the sales side of the room. He peeled the label off the lemonade and rolled it up and put it on the edge of his desk and got straight into a nasty problem where a customer's site permits weren't matching their return lines, and he fixed it in about 40 minutes, properly, cleanly, better than I would have. I watched him do it and thought, with a warmth that embarrasses me now, that he was actually very good at this, and that maybe I'd build a whole story out of a kettle conversation and a sausage roll. I said as much to Sian on Wednesday night. I said I think I've been unfair to him. She said you've been tired since March. I said maybe I overreacted about the button as well. Nobody's even using it. And she said, gently, that I should go to bed. The deadline was midnight on Friday. The phone went off at 4:03 on Thursday morning. Not 3 in the morning, 4, which I mentioned because everyone who tells one of these says 3, and I remember the numbers on the ceiling being a 4. First 4 minutes. I sat up, put my glasses on, read the alert, which said the filing queue was not draining. I went downstairs in a t-shirt and no socks, opened the laptop on the kitchen counter, and looked at the number of returns waiting to be stamped. It was 81,000 and rising by about 400 a second. Our normal number for a busy night is under 200. I said a word I don't say in front of Elin. Then I rang Hamish. He picked up on the second ring, which frightened me more than if he hadn't, and he was whispering. He said, "Alistair, I'm at 9 Wells. My mother's had a stroke. I'm in a corridor." I said, "Oh God, Hamish." He said they took her in at 11 last night, and they're doing a scan at some point, and he couldn't tell me when. I asked him one question because I'm not a saint. I asked him if there was any way to make the stamping machine take things slower, and he said there's a setting, but it never got wired up, and then a nurse said something to him, and he said I have to go, and he went. I stood in my kitchen in the dark and understood that the only person who really knew that machine was in a hospital corridor 500 miles away, waiting to hear about his mom, and that everything a few hundred waste companies needed to do by Friday midnight went through it. By half, for there were 5 of us on a call. Yvonne, whose overnight phone had started ringing at 2:30 and hadn't stopped. Meredith, who arrived at the office at 5 with her laptop and a paper bag of pastries from the garage on Ashton Road, and put them down where everyone could reach them. Jonah, who nobody had called, who had woken up, seen the group chat, got on his bike and come in. And Fergus, who joined the call at 4:50 and said almost nothing for a very long time. Here is what everybody could see. Every customer logging in saw their returns sitting there marked as sending. Not failed. Sending. Which is the worst possible word, because a failed return you can file again, and a sending return you just have to stare at. Taro Waste Group's night administrator, a woman called Pauline who I have never met and think about more than she'd believe, had clicked bulk file at 10 to 3 in the morning for 411 sites, exactly as we had built her to. That was the first domino. And it turned out Taro weren't the only ones, because 2 other national firms had found the button that week and loved it, and their overnight run stacked up behind Pauline's. Trevor arrived at 20 past 5. He came into the office in a fleece over what were unmistakably pajamas, with his car keys still in his hand, and his face was the color of a filing cabinet. He stood behind my chair and said, in a small voice, "Tell me what I'm looking at." So I told him, out loud, in the room, with Meredith and Jonah listening. I said, "There's one machine that gets us the receipt numbers, and every return has to go through it." At about 10 to 3 it got slow, because 411 returns arrived in the same second, and then a few hundred more behind them. And nothing else in our setup was built to wait. Every other machine asked it for a receipt, waited 30 seconds, gave up, and asked again. And every ask became a new job in the pile. So the slower it got, the more work we sent it. It didn't crash, Trevor. We buried it. There are 81,000 things in that queue, and about 900 of them are real. Trevor looked at the screen for a while, and then said, "So it's a speed thing." Meredith made a noise into her pastry that she turned into a cough. I said, "It's a shouting thing. Nobody in there knows how to wait." Then we tried things, and they failed one after another, and each one failed for its own stupid reason. First we restarted the stamping machine, because that is what you do, and it came back up clean and healthy and lasted 11 seconds before the 81,000 waiting jobs found it and put it back on the floor. Jonah said, out loud, "Oh, it's like opening the doors at a sale," which is the best sentence anyone said all day. Second, we went for the cap, the limit on how many returns could be in flight, because if we could turn that back on, we could hold the crowd at the door. The switch was still there in the settings screen. Meredith turned it on. Nothing changed at all, and after 20 minutes of me reading things and swearing quietly, I worked out why. When the cap was switched off in March, the part that actually read the setting had been taken out. So the switch was a switch connected to nothing. A light in a house with no bulb. I sat back in my chair and put both hands flat on the desk and did not say anything for about 15 seconds, and Meredith, beside me, said, "Right? So that's why the demo got faster." Third, and this was Trevor's idea, and it wasn't a bad one. We tried to put last week's version back. We have a button for that. Nobody had ever pressed it in anger. It ran for 4 minutes and said it had worked, and then the product wouldn't start because the new return form had added those 2 destination fields to how we store things, and last week's version looked at the new records and refused to open its eyes. The button restored the program and not the shape of the data. Fergus, who had been silent for an hour, said quietly that he'd always assumed that button was tested. Nobody replied to that. Fourth, Trevor rang the regulator to ask about an extension at 6 in the morning and got a recorded message telling him the duty line opened at 9. He rang it 3 more times anyway. At one point, he was standing by the window with the phone to his ear listening to hold music, and Yvonne walked past him with her headset on saying, "No, I completely understand. No, I know," to a man in Doncaster whose fine would be personal. Rosalind joined at 6:30 from her kitchen, and you could hear a radio being turned off behind her. She asked how bad, and I said if we fix it by tonight, nobody misses the deadline. She said, and if we don't, and I said then a few hundred companies file late, and every single one of them knows exactly whose fault it is. Jonah went out to the stairwell at about 7. I found him there 10 minutes later sitting on the step below the fire door with his phone in both hands, crying in that awful contained way people do at work, trying to do it quietly. He said, "I pushed it." I said, "Pushed what, mate?" And he said the bulk filing thing. He said Fergus messaged him Tuesday morning early and said the plan had changed, that it was needed for the launch, that Alistair had signed off and was just slow at admin, and that Jonah should put it live and Fergus would tick the box for it. He said he'd asked if he should message me and Fergus said don't wake him, he's got a lot on at home. I sat down on the step next to him. I want to say I stayed calm because I'm a good person, but really it was because he was 23 and he'd been there 3 weeks, and he had made exactly the mistake that anyone makes when a person with 9 years service tells them the plan changed. I said, "You didn't do this." I said, "Go and wash your face and come back in, because I'm going to need you at a keyboard." Then I went back to my desk and did the only thing left, which was to do it by hand. From 7:20 until about 11, I wrote a small thing that went through the pile, threw away every duplicate ask. Some returns were in there 60 times, the same document, 60 copies of the same shout, and then fed what was left to the stamping machine one at a time, waiting for each receipt before sending the next. For seconds a return, 940 real returns. I read the count out loud to the room, every 100 like a darts scorer, because it was the only thing keeping anyone's shoulders down. And when it got past 500, Yvonne stood up at her desk and clapped once, just the one clap, and sat back down. The last of Thursday's backlog cleared at 20 to 2 on Thursday afternoon. Friday's traffic went through the same drip feed, for seconds at a time, all day and into the evening, with me sat next to it like a man watching a kettle, and the last return of the quarter got its receipt number at 10 on Friday night. Nobody filed late. Not one company. I drove home and sat in the car on the drive for a while, and then went in and slept until 2 in the afternoon on Saturday. The meeting was Monday, 9:30, in the room with the broken blind, and there were 9 of us in there. Rosalind sat at the end with her hands folded. Trevor sat next to her in an actual shirt. Fergus came in last with a bottle of water and sat down and put it on the table in front of him. Rosalind said, "What happened?" Fergus took it. He said it had been a very difficult week, and that the machine that talks to the regulator had been fragile for years, which everyone in the room knew, and that in his view this had been coming for a long time, and he was glad it had happened now rather than in December. He said he'd been signed off sick on the Tuesday, properly ill, and that he'd been nowhere near a computer, so he wasn't going to pretend he had a full picture of what went out. Rosalind said, "Explain the button being live." He shifted. He said he honestly couldn't say. He said there'd been a lot of moving parts and a lot of people making changes in launch week, and he wasn't going to point fingers, and then he pointed one, gently, the way people do when they want credit for restraint. He said, "Look, we've got a lad who's 3 weeks in. Nobody's blaming him. But if you put someone new into a launch week, they will misread a plan, and I think that's what's happened here, and the fault for that sits with whoever left him unsupervised." Jonah went the color of paper. Meredith looked at the ceiling. Rosalind said, "And the limit that got switched off in March." And Fergus said, and I remember this properly, he said that was a group decision in a room full of people, and he wasn't going to be the one to carry it on his own. And that frankly, if Alistair had thought it was that serious, he'd have escalated it instead of raising it once and moving on. That was the second time he'd handed it to somebody else in 4 minutes, and I felt my jaw go tight and my hand find the edge of the desk, and I said nothing, because Meredith was already reaching into her bag. She prints a list every Friday. Has done for 2 years. Who put what live and who ticked it off, 1 line each, name and the minute. And she pins it on the pillar by the kitchen because she thinks it's funny, and because, she says, people behave better when their name's on a wall. She'd printed the launch week one on the Friday and never got round to pinning it up on account of everything. She slid it down the table to Rosalind, face up, and said, "That's just the weekly one." Rosalind read it for about 10 seconds. Then she said, "Bulk filing. Live at 9 minutes past 7 on Tuesday morning. Approved at 12 minutes past 7. Whose name is that?" The room got very quiet. Fergus reached for the bottle and started peeling the label, and his fingers weren't working properly, and the strip tore about a third of the way down. He said, "I can explain that," and his voice went on the word explain, cracked up into a register I'd never heard out of him in 6 years. Rosalind said, "Go on then." He didn't. He looked at the table. Trevor was staring at him with his mouth slightly open like a man who has just understood a joke from last week. Yvonne, at the far end, had her arms crossed and was looking directly at Fergus and not blinking. And the phrase that went through my head, uncharitably, was that she'd spent 9 hours saying sorry on his behalf to people who were about to be fined. Rosalind stood up and said, "Thank you, everyone." And then, "Fergus, stay?" He was walked out at 20 past 11 with a jacket over his arm and a laptop bag he didn't get to keep the laptop out of, and the whole floor pretended to be looking at their screens, badly. The group chat went completely feral for about 40 minutes, and then somebody posted a photograph of 11 little paper pellets still lined up along the edge of his empty desk, and someone else replied with the single word ammunition, and that was the last anyone said about it out loud. The cap got put back, wired up to a switch that actually does something this time. The other machines learned to wait longer each time instead of shouting, which took me 9 days, and which Trevor approved without asking whether it was a speed thing. Hamish came back after 2 weeks. His mom is in a rehabilitation unit and can move her right hand, and he spent a month writing down what was in his head in a document, in English, that I have read twice. Jonah is still here and is better than he thinks he is. Rosalind gave me the senior role in the first week of August, and Meredith sent me a message that said, "Congratulations, don't get ill." I paid the first invoice from the school car park on a Tuesday morning in September, sitting in the driver's seat with the engine off and my phone in my hand, and Sian on speaker asking if it had gone through. It had. Elin knocked on the window from the other side, in a jumper 2 sizes too big, and asked if I'd be there at pickup on Fridays. I said yes. Fridays are fine now.